Hello, BookTube. I'm Pet, the Book Prize Addict, and I'm spending a lot of my time these days, I have lots of time to read, like most people, reading some book prizes that are not so well known. There's a lot of better known ones out, the Women's Prize, Booker's coming up, but I've taken a liking to some of the, I guess you would say, minor prizes, especially ones from England that I haven't heard of the books on the list, and I feel like it's something different. I learned something different. So I'm going to do a series of the different prizes, and each week just select a couple books from each prize and talk about it. And I'm going to be giving links to the prizes down below, just in case you want to read about these prizes too. Okay, the first one I'm going to talk about is the Dylan Thomas Award. This is given to someone, a writer under 40, just any genre, and that's because Dylan Thomas himself died when he was 39. So it's for younger writers, young to me anyway. And anyway, the winner was announced just the other day, and an unusual thing, the short list, 6 books were on the short list, and 3 of them were poetry. One was short story, and there were 2 novels. But I was very interested in the fact that 3 of them were poetry. This is done by a university type judging, so you know, I felt like it must be literary anyway. So I bought the 3 poetry books that were on the short list, and they're all slim volumes, as Steve Donahue says, and they were cheap. So I thought I'd just say a little bit about these and how I approach these books of poetry. I actually took a poetry class, a college level class at one time, and all I learned was that poetry was hard to read. I mean, there's all kind of things you had to look for, similes and metaphors and the meter, and you know, it just made me think that poetry was hard and you had to read it real slow and some lines over and over until you got it. And I just hate to read slow. So I got these 3, and I figured, well, surely not everybody else reads them slow and knows all the poetic terms. So I decided I was just going to read them like a novel. Just read and keep reading and see. And I was surprised. By the end, I knew what the poetry was about. It's just kind of a different way of getting it across. So I just want to go quickly over the 3 poetry books. I won't bore you by reading any poetry. The first one, J. Bernard, was called Surge. And this is done by written by a young black man, and it has to do with 2 different fires in London. The New Cross fire, I believe, was in 1981, where it was a party and many young black people were killed, and then the Grenfell Tower, which was just a few years ago. And it's just, since he kind of goes from one to the other, talks about things in these, I learned a lot. And he even has the 1981 poster calling people to demonstrate. It says, support Black People's Day of Action. It looks like 81. It was kind of interesting. He has other like actual artifacts from those times in here. So my first one I read was a success. I got it. Okay. Next I read Mary Jean Chan's FLÈCHE. Now, FLÈCHE is actually a pun. In French, it means arrow, and it's a fencing move. She was a fencer, or is a fencer. And so it has that feeling of being attacked, being, stabbed, whatever. And it also, of course, the pun is the English word flesh. It's pronounced flesh. And so this has a lot to do with her life as a non-white queer person, how she learned to try to be herself against the attacks that she felt like she was given. There's a lot also about her mother and her mother's experience during the Chinese Revolution. My favorite one was a poem called Rules for a Chinese Child Buying Stationery in a London Bookshop. And it was kind of tongue-in-cheek about how, I guess, Chinese children had a prejudice against him, and it was telling her, you know, he had to say please, thank you, be very nice, and they'd even let you buy a book. That gave me an idea of what victims of racism might feel like and have to do in their lives. Okay, the third poetry book is called If All the World and Love Were Young. It's actually about this young man. He played video games as a child, and there's one in particular, I'm not good on video games, called Super Mario World. It has a lot of different levels, and I guess it had very unusual visuals, and he talks a lot about that and how that kind of took him away. It was an escape for him. He also talks about his mother's death and how the video game was part of being able to accept things. So that could certainly apply to some people like today, though Super Mario was many years ago that people played that. Okay, so those are the three poetries. I wouldn't have minded if any of them won. I thought they were all good. I mean, I got it. I realized that poetry is saying something just in a different way than a novel says something. And so anyway, but the winner of the Dylan Thomas Award was the short story book called Lot by Bryan Washington. And this takes place in Houston. He lives in Houston, quite a young man. And it takes place around different areas, immigrant areas in Houston. And my very favorite in just things that happen there is one called Lot, and it's very good in itself. It goes through a family there, and they own a restaurant, and what happens to the family and losing it was very good. But my very favorite was called Alief, A-L-I-E-F. It even has a picture of the map of the Houston there. It's the second story in the book, and it's advertised as the affair at an apartment complex that threw the whole neighborhood into shock and disarray. And it actually was. It's amazing how he handled all the people in the apartment complex that were noticing this affair and what was happening in the affair between a woman and a married woman and a man, and how that comes out. It's just, again, I started noticing the way authors handle groups, handle things like that, and he did a great job in all of them, but particularly in that one with the characters, I thought. Okay, that's it for the Dylan Thomas. Another one I'm reading, trying to read all 10 of, is the Elliott Desmond, and I don't think they've even chosen a short list for this. If not, I'm not going to look into it because the short list is 3 out of the 10, and I want to I have access to most of the 10. I want to read them, but I actually have not finished this, but I have to tell you about ASGHAR and ZAHRA, and it has to do with a young Muslim couple who live in London, and they get married at a very young age, and it's kind of an arranged marriage, but not quite. I mean, they feel like they're picking each other, but they don't know each other very well. Plus the fact the young man, the groom, is like 17 or 18, and the woman has been through college. She's into her 20s and is much more experienced than he is, and it's just hilarious. It's so well done. Again, the characters are a strong point in this. They go on the honeymoon, and there's some funny tales about it. But while they're on the honeymoon, the groom's mother and father own a decorating business, and they come on over to the new couple's apartment and decorate it. Can you imagine your mother-in-law decorating your apartment while you're on your honeymoon? So I'm looking forward to finishing this, and do take a look at the Desmond Elliott list below. I hope to get to most of these books and talk about them. They're all really different, and it's amazing. They're all debuts, but I haven't heard of any of them. Okay, on with that. Now, the biggie that I've been doing this week is I have started reading the, what do they call it, the most prestigious crime award called the Sexton's Old Peculiar Crime Award, and it was put out a week ago, and I talked about it in my last come on here, there we go. Okay, in my last video, that I was going to try to read all 18 on that, because they're mainly, again, pretty high quality mysteries. This is a time when I really like reading mysteries for some reason. So I've read the first 5 of those. Now, as I read them, when I compare a lot of books like that, I like to give them numbers, and I have 6 different categories I judge them in, and it's 5 points per category, and so there's a perfect 30 points. And as I go through, I give them those points, which I'm not going to tell you what the points are. I'll just use that at the end. I have to say none of them are bad. None of them so far are bad. So, but today I'm going to take the 5 I read and put them in order of how I liked them, with the least first going to the best, which doesn't mean any of them are bad, but I just had to put them in some kind of order. Okay, the first one I have here is called Blue Moon, and it's a new one by Lee Child. Anybody that reads any American mysteries at all knows about Lee Child. He's very famous for his Jack Reacher novels. You see that the author's name is bigger than the title and even the Jack Reacher. I've read it. I think this is his 24th one, and the interesting thing about it is he has announced this is his last book written by himself. He's 65, and he just doesn't want to write anymore by himself. So his brother is also a crime writer, and after this, it'll have both his brother and his names on them. And I suppose he'll gradually just bow out. So it'll be interesting to see what comes up. But I have to tell you, the 24th one and his last one alone, it wasn't as good as a lot of them I've read. Now, a lot of them start the same way. You don't have to read them all. They're all about Jack Reacher. But he's a guy, long story behind it, who travels across the country, usually by bus, and the story usually starts with him getting off the bus in some little town somewhere, and then he finds some horrible crime to solve, and manages to solve it and get the girl. This one just wasn't as good. It's almost kind of boring. The small town he goes to has a mafia style gangs with some European or Asian gangs. I can't remember who the gangs are now, but they're people you would know of. Russian gangs, and there's 2 of them, and it gets into the story of that. And it was hard to keep them separated, who was who. Just not his best. And I'm cheating. I read some other reviews, and a lot of people thought this wasn't, definitely not his best. But it's okay. I mean, and if you haven't read it, just start anywhere. Okay, next we have Smoke and Ashes by an Indian writer. And this is his 3rd, and it's a historical mystery, which I also like that part of the genre, historical mystery. Gosh, that's dark. I wonder if I could lighten it up. Oh well. Anyway, it's deals with it's right after First World War. It takes place, and the main character, Captain Wyndham, is an Englishman who was injured during the in Asia during the First World War, and gets an opium habit from his injury, and comes and gets on the Calcutta police force, and he has an actual Indian man, well-to-do, who becomes his partner, and together they work and solve mysteries. And the thing I like about it is it has a lot of actual history. I love to get my history through novels, and Gandhi makes an appearance here, and the Prince of Wales from Europe, who was then, I believe, Edward, comes for a visit, and there's things going on. India is beginning to want its independence, and the best part is, I told you he has an opium habit, and he's trying to break it, but he can't, and he goes to an opium den there in Calcutta, and that is a great set piece of him in that opium den. It's near the front, so you might want to give it a try. Okay, I expect to see that on the some of the Dagger prizes. There's a well, I'll be talking about the Dagger prize soon because it comes out in June. There's a historical mystery category in it, and his other ones have been on it and actually won it a couple times. Okay, next we have this one. No. Will Carver, who I hadn't heard of, and the book's called Nothing Important Happened Today. I've got this right in the middle of this list, but it could go up or down, probably up. It's the most unusual book. It says right on it, 9 suicides, 1 cult, no leader. Well, that kind of tells it. The whole first part of the book talks about different people and how they appear and have this mass suicide, and nobody knows who the leader is, and it keeps happening. And I had a hard time getting started on it and getting through that part because I didn't know what was going on. But I'll tell you, the ending, well, really is fantastic. I'm not going to say any more. It's just the most unusual thing I've read, so I would suggest that. I'd like to hear what somebody else thinks of that, but you have to read to the end. Anyway, okay, the next one, second to best of this week, is Val McDermid's How the Dead Speak. If you read any English mysteries at all, you know that Val is probably the most popular, the most famous. She does all kind of literary work and judging and helping other mystery authors. And this, usually you don't have to read her books in series. They do have, well, she has several different sets of characters that are detectives, and most of them show up but you don't have to read them all. I've read like several, enough to know the characters, but I have to tell you, she warns people at the book before this, which I forgot the name, but I'll put it below. You need to read the book before this before you read this, because it has such a shocking ending, and you really want to enjoy that ending. And she asked people not to tell people what the ending is, so I'm not telling. But you need to read it first, which I did, went back and read it, and then read this one. Now, it has a lot of different threads, so I can talk a little bit about some of the other threads that don't have anything to do with that shocking thing from the book before. Actually, the best part, the biggest thread is there's an old, not a monastery, well, it may have been a monastery, but nuns had been there. It was a girls' school, old one, and they find a lot of bodies buried. And I won't go into it, but she is wonderful with the forensics of bodies and how you tell what happened, and it's real complex and quite long, but it's worth it. And it really, she again really handles the different threads of the story well, almost different stories, and the characters, she's good. You can tell she's a very experienced writer. Okay, and last, my favorite from this week's reading was called The Lost Man. Oh, that's awful. By Jane Harper. This takes place in Australia, and this is her third book. The first one was called The Dry, and it won a lot of prizes. And I have to say, this takes place out in the, what are they called? I don't know if that's what they call the outback, but miles and miles of nothing but dust and land, and it takes place on I guess you call a farm like that, with 3 brothers. One's found dead at a gravesite. I mean, he's not in the gravesite. He's found dead there, and it really goes into. She does an excellent job with the characters. There aren't a lot of characters. All the characters are there on the farm. There's a couple backpackers that show up, to figure out what happened. And she does such a good job with, what do you call it, when you give little flashes of what's going to happen in the future, with that forecasting? No, well, it's some word anyway, without telling what it is. And she does a great job, because it's hard, I'm sure, with just such few characters, not to give anything away or make it too obvious. But I'd almost like to read it again, because there's little places where she says, he had a curious look, and you're like, huh, why? And then at the end you realize who was thinking what and what was going on, but I really had no idea till the end what really happened. So that's my favorite so far. Now that's 5. I have 13 more to read, so I'm going to get started on those. Okay, have a good week. I'll be back next week, I hope, with more reading from the minor book prizes, as we say. Bye.